What would happen if there was suddenly no government? Let's find out. Hello everyone, this is My Two Cents. The Infographics Show recently released a video that set out to describe, in their own words, how important government is. However, they made a number of stunning admissions in the video, and whether they know it or not, actually did a pretty good job of demonstrating that society would be much better off without government and operating under free market conditions. Once a few of their faulty assumptions are corrected, this video actually ends up making the case for anarcho-capitalism. I'd like to thank my patron, Scorch88, for bringing this video to my attention, and as a reminder, all patrons who donate $10 a month or more are guaranteed to have their video requests made once they've been a patron for more than 2 months. Let's get into it.
Government is the body that runs the country. One or more political parties make up the government, and a huge team of civil servants supports them. Politicians often attend debates and meetings in government buildings where they decide on what policies will or will not work and how the national budget should be spent. A good government protects and provides for the people. It keeps the country moving forward. Today, we'll look into just how important the government is. In this episode of the Infographics Show, what if the government suddenly disappeared?
Ironically, you're actually about to demonstrate that government isn't necessary at all, and in fact, hinders human progress forward. We'd all be better off without it.
It's not hard to find examples of countries functioning without government. Belgium sets the record for the longest period without an elected government in a democracy, when between 2010 and 2011, there was a 589-day break after wrangling between Flemish and Walloon figures.
I should make clear that Belgium was not a stateless society during this time period. The government was merely in an electoral deadlock, resulting in Belgian officials being powerless to do anything but argue with one another. However, it's worth noting that during this period where the government had no legislative or executive power, Belgium flourished. In 2001, Business Insider reported, quote, "In the last quarter, the Belgian economy has actually grown faster than that of a number of its neighbors, including the UK, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Finland, and Switzerland. Belgium's 0.7% GDP growth was also higher than the Eurozone's average of 0.2%.
And Spain spent the first 10 months of 2016 in a similar position, with a stalemate between socialists and conservatives.
And as with Belgium, Spain's economy experienced unprecedented economic growth during this period, as well as a reduction in unemployment.
Beyond Europe, it's not difficult to find more examples. Iraq went without a government for much of 2010, towards the end of the war. What happens when there is no government depends a lot on the backup plan the country has, as well as the cultural response.
This statement is true so far as it goes, but as an important aside, I'd like to point out that many of the examples that people point to and call stateless societies are in fact societies where there are different states competing for control. If, for example, there are 2 or more armed militias both trying to exert their control over a given population, this isn't a stateless society. It's a society in a state of civil war between 2 different groups that are both trying to gain the monopoly on force and hence become the one legitimate government in the eyes of the world. On the other hand, history is full of actual stateless societies where no such warfare was constantly taking place, such as medieval Iceland, settlements in the American Wild West, and in reality, just about all of human history until about 5,000 years ago.
So what would happen in the US? The first few days. Let's just assume that in this case study, you simply woke up one day and the government had disappeared overnight, vanished into thin air, leaving us all to fend for ourselves. One of the first things most of us do after waking up is brush our teeth. But when you go to turn on the tap, knowing there is no public services authority, you'd be wondering, is the water supply safe to drink? Who's decontaminating it from dangerous bacteria?
Actually, a lot of Americans are already asking that question. That's why many people hire private corporations, like Culligan Water, to install water filters in their home, since they've done tests that prove that the public water utilities are doing a piss-poor job of keeping the water clean. The mere fact that there are already private corporations that produce water filters and purified bottled water proves that the state is unnecessary to provide clean water.
Feeling a little gritty with your unbrushed teeth, you might head back to the bedroom to get dressed for work. But if you use public transport for the commute, you'll soon realize you can't get there. We're only 20 minutes into the day, and it's already looking bleak.
So I'm guessing you didn't consider maybe grabbing your smartphone and ordering up an Uber or a Lyft driver? Private taxi services, as well as the wildly successful ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft, prove that public transport services are definitely not required for society to function. In fact, these services help many people make a little extra cash while operating at costs far lower than the government spends on public transportation.
You decide to check up on the latest news to see how much impact the lack of government is having on the country. There would be chaos in the financial markets. The US federal debt exceeded $21 trillion in March 2018, and it is the largest single investment instrument in the market. If the federal government disappeared, there would be no guarantee of the debt being honored.
The national debt already isn't being honored. Once a person understands how the Federal Reserve banking system works, it becomes clear that all the government is doing to fund itself is borrowing money that the Fed has printed into existence, backed by nothing, and then using that new money to pay its budget and existing debt obligations, which subsequently leaves the government with even more debt to pay off the next time around, and a dollar that is constantly losing value. This is the biggest scam in the history of mankind, and its fate was sealed the moment the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law in 1913. The US dollar will collapse, whether the United States government remains in power or not. In fact, it's far more likely that the US government will lose its power as a result of the dollar collapsing.
The value of the US dollar would also become completely questionable. Each note is backed by what's known as the full faith and credit of the US government.
In other words, nothing at all. The US dollar derives its value from nothing more than the government using force to require that it be accepted as so-called legal tender, and through the military enforcement of international exchange policies such as the petrodollar. However, no amount of government action will ultimately be able to stop the inevitable collapse of the dollar. I'll leave links to some of my own videos, and videos made by colleagues of mine that explain this in greater detail if you'd like to learn more.
But with no US government, what would it be worth? The federal government is also responsible for a whole host of corporate functions such as taxes, regulations, and trade operations. There's no backup plan to keep any of this going if the whole government disappeared overnight.
And all that taxes and regulations do is increase the cost burden on private business, which is why it's no surprise that the economies in Belgium and Spain began to thrive once the government was out of their way. This isn't a bad thing.
One thing that may shoot up in value would be gold and silver, as precious metals would always be worth something in trade, so quick-thinking investors would jump on that.
Smart investors would already keep a sizable portion of their assets in precious metals anyways. Whether the Infographics Show realizes it or not, they've just refuted the idea that governments are necessary for money to exist, since precious metals have been used as a medium of exchange long before and long after the first governments. These metals are naturally scarce, divisible, fungible, and inherently useful, thus guaranteeing that they will always assert themselves as money in any society.
It's a pretty dreary first morning as you sit watching the financial chaos, wishing you could brush your teeth. The first few weeks. After the crazy start, life would need to carry on in one way or another. Where governments have fallen apart or been overthrown, the capability of the military often plays a big part in what happens next.
This is true to a degree, but it is affected by numerous other factors. In particular, whether or not private citizens in the society own firearms. If the government falls in a country where the average citizen is not permitted to own a firearm, then the standing military will easily be able to step in and create a new de facto government, since the people have no means to resist. However, in a country like the United States, where there are more private firearms than there are people, even an advanced and well-trained military force will have difficulty taking over. The Founding Fathers themselves acknowledged that the right to bear arms was to protect the people from such a scenario. In fact, men like Jefferson and Madison favored an armed populace without a standing army for this very reason.
Using Thailand as an example, in May 2014, the Royal Thai Armed Forces launched a military coup against the government of Thailand following 6 months of political crisis. The military established what was called the National Council for Peace and Order, or NCPO, to govern the nation. With the military stepping in, they took on the responsibilities of the government, which limited the disruption.
Hence, this is an example of a country trading one government for another, not a country without government.
However, Thailand has been through this process a number of times, and there would likely be a lot more chaos if the US government disappeared.
This is why armed revolutions are an ineffective means of getting rid of a tyrannical government. In the vast majority of cases, they simply set the stage for an even worse government to take its place.
Assuming most businesses carried on as normal, with the lack of federal government, there would be no reason to deduct taxes from wages, so workers would receive bigger paychecks. That's good news, right?
Yes?
Maybe not, as systems such as the federal Social Security program would also stall, and retired people would struggle to find the cash for day-to-day living. And Medicare would disappear, causing havoc in the health sector. There would quickly need to be state-level authority before further community functions fell apart.
Oh, give me a break. The 65 and older demographic is the highest earning demographic in the nation, so don't give me this garbage about how senior citizens would be starving and dying of curable diseases were it not for Social Security and Medicare. However, even if this weren't the case, Social Security and Medicare are unsustainable Ponzi schemes that the government has already admitted are broke. Finally, even if they weren't already broke, one would hardly be living above the poverty line if they were trying to live solely on Social Security benefits as they are now. If you're trying to argue that government is necessary for society to function, then Social Security and Medicare are the last places you want to go. People with successful retirements are those that put their money in private investments, like an IRA or a 401k, and healthcare would be immensely cheaper and more widely available were it not for heavy government regulation of the healthcare and insurance industries.
Who would pay USDA inspectors, FAA flight controllers, and other key personnel?
Ever heard of the Better Business Bureau? FINRA? Heck, even Yelp? Private accountability firms already exist and do a much more efficient job of ensuring that businesses are putting out trustworthy products than any sort of government agency does.
And how would federal prisons continue to run? Or would they simply open their doors and set everyone free?
Well, I certainly hope that prisoners who are in there for victimless crimes are set free. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, more than half of federal inmates are in prison for drug offenses. No one should be rotting in prison for putting a substance in their body, especially if no one else was harmed in the process. As for those that are there for violating the non-aggression principle, private prisons already account for at least 8.5% of incarcerations, so there's no reason to think that the private sector couldn't efficiently take over corrections operations.
It's not easy to answer these questions, as it would come down to many factors. The most important question being, who would step up and take responsibility in these first few vital months?
Well, the reality is that humans tend to act in their own self-interest, so individuals and families would do what they had to ensure their own safety and sustainment. This is why the government is completely unnecessary for people to voluntarily exchange goods and services to their own benefit. It's absolutely true that the transition may not be pretty in some parts of the country, and some people would undoubtedly try to gain a monopoly on force to assert themselves as a new government. However, such endeavors would only be likely to succeed in regions where the majority of people did not own guns or were otherwise unable to defend themselves.
It's quite possible that the banking sector might take some control, as the major banks hold a lot of the country's wealth. Something similar happened in New York in 1975, when the city found itself in a debt crisis and was forced to hand some of the authority to its lenders. The banks formed a committee called the Municipal Assistance Corporation and set out to control the city's finances. This resulted in thousands of teachers, police officers, and firefighters being sacked. So it's not unimaginable that the likes of Citigroup and Bank of America could band together in an attempt to create a replacement system and even form a new currency.
Of course they would. In fact, I guarantee that the bankers will do whatever they can to hold on to their power. However, with the creation of cryptocurrencies, bankers are already discovering that even with the government on their side, they are losing their ability to manipulate financial markets. Once the government is gone, banks will have no way to force people to accept whatever currency they create, and so they would not be able to reestablish the current scam of the Federal Reserve System.
A few months in, more issues would crop up as time passes. Assuming that a local authority did not take responsibility for the federal food inspection system, there would eventually be contaminated food on supermarket shelves and in restaurants, potentially leading to mass disease.
You really think people are going to keep buying from restaurants or grocery stores that are selling contaminated food? Again, private accountability services could replace government ones and do a more efficient job of ensuring that businesses are behaving ethically. But even without such services, in a free market, Businesses that provide food are directly incentivized to ensure that their products are not contaminated, since no one will ever buy from them again the moment word gets out that they are selling contaminated food. This goes for any kind of business that wants to ensure that its customers keep buying. And even if for some reason a particular food business didn't improve its practices after word got out, competition could enter the market much quicker without government regulations that make it more expensive and difficult to start a business.
There would certainly have been a major economic collapse, and with thousands more people out of work and all major government activities ceased, it's highly likely this would lead to civil unrest as people start to lose patience.
True, but sooner or later, protesters are going to realize that crying about how welfare no longer exists isn't going to fill their bellies, so they'll either get with the program and start contributing to society, or starve.
It's hard to say what would happen with interstate commerce. Would companies be hampered by the absence of a federal court system and a means of resolving state boundary legalities? You would hope that corporate responsibility and the importance of reputation would see most disputes resolved.
Of course it would, so long as businesses wanted to keep making a profit.
The tax system would be well and truly broken by this stage, with the non-existence of income taxes, capital gains taxes, and excise taxes. So even if there were some states ruling, they would need to find a way to raise revenue to pay for the services previously handled by the federal government.
I cannot be clear enough about this. So long as there is demand for something, the private sector will provide it, and at better quality and greater efficiency, since they'll only get paid if people actually choose to purchase their product. Private security, private trash collectors, private schools, private transportation. These are things that already exist.
1 year on. A year in, and America would likely be considered a third world country, with society looking more like it did in the 18th century, with a great deal more responsibility back in the hands of citizens.
Oh, please. You think society is going to regress back to how it was in colonial America just because there's no government? All the technological advancements of the last 3 centuries will just disappear? This isn't Revolution or The Walking Dead. The lack of a state doesn't mean no electricity or tons of zombies. In any case, I find it interesting that you say America will become like a third world country. Over the past century, if we look at countries that might have been referred to as third world, we'll find that those that have done more to lessen government intervention in the market and embrace free trade have seen a dramatic increase in their standard of living and a dramatic decrease in poverty. China and India being 2 of the biggest examples. In fact, some of the poorest countries in the world were once wealthy, but became poor as a direct result of their governments. Venezuela.
There might be town council meetings to decide whether to allow business projects to go forward, and what was left of the corporate sector would probably play a major role in societal governance. Instead of a Food and Drug Administration, perhaps business or community would demand an independent organization to develop standards, conduct tests, and certify which drugs were safe and effective. By now, the prisons would likely all be privately run, and you would hope that other functions previously managed by the government would fall into the hands of people or small businesses.
Wait. Did you just admit that the private sector can do everything that the government does so long as there's demand for those services?
Somalia went with no functioning national government for 2 decades, until 2012, when an internationally backed government was installed. There was much chaos and fighting during that time, but people still got by, and the country sets a good example of how people respond to collective problems without government.
Yes. I found it amusing that you bring this up, since so many people always say, "If you like anarchy so much, why don't you go live in Somalia?" The reality is that Somalia was already in horrible shape prior to its stateless period, and so it's no surprise that life didn't magically become Disneyland once the government fell. However, in a peer-reviewed paper published in the Journal of Comparative Ethics, author Peter Leeson found that nearly every factor that is used to determine the welfare of a country improved during Somalia's so-called stateless period. So, Somalia improved after its government fell. Spanish and Belgian economies experienced massive growth while their governments were deadlocked and ineffectual. I'm noticing a trend here. Are you?
In many parts of the country, communities organize themselves to solve collective problems and provide public goods, and residents manage to maintain daily routines much like those in more developed countries. Private sector firms offered basic utilities and services, such as garbage removal and clean water sources, and small local council units took responsibility for jobs normally left to the state.
So you're admitting that government is unnecessary then? I thought at the beginning you said you were going to show us how important government is.
Removing the government certainly sounds like a bad idea, but does society see it that way? We looked at debate.org, an online community debating website, where we found a debate titled, "Is Life Without Government Possible?" That vote came in with 58% of people saying it would be possible. One subscriber argued it would be utopia. Worldwide anarchy is something to strive for. It would not be utter chaos.
No matter how you slice it, the data is clear. The more totalitarian a government, the worse off the country is. The less control the government has, the better off the country is. Now, the only prevailing lie that seems to persist is that some form of government itself is always necessary. Anything that a tax-funded state can do, private services can do better. I dare anyone to try and prove me wrong on this point. Anyways, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth. Thanks everyone for watching. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. You can also hit the bell to ensure you're notified every time I upload a new video. This video was made possible by my patrons. If anyone else would like to donate and help ensure that I have the time and resources to keep putting out content, for just $1 a month on Patreon or Maker Support, you'll have your name listed in the end credits of every video and the link to one of your social media platforms listed in the description. You can also support the channel by purchasing my 2 cents merchandise on Teespring. You can also follow me on Twitter, Minds.com, BitChute, WordPress, Gab, and iTunes. Uploads are every Thursday and Saturday, so stay tuned for more videos.